I remain cautious about taking the opposition's role here in the Civil War.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Brian Higgins of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That Bashir al-Assad used chemical weapons, I think, is clear, compelling, and irrefutable. However, I think that fact, experience, and history are all needed here as well. The situation in Syria is that of a national civil war, an ethnic and sectarian conflict that America cannot solve and should not try to. This is not a fight for freedom and democracy. There is no democracy movement in Syria. There's no unifying vision or social contract, not a constitution or even a preamble of what Syria wants to become. This is nothing more than a fight for control between two sectarian factions, an Alawite faction, or a militia, with air power, supported by the Assad regime, and a mix of Islamic militias, estimated to be about 1,000, with no air power. This is a conflict between a brutal and murderous dictator and an opposition whose best fighters are represented by al-Qaeda affiliates and Islamic extremists bent on creating an Islamist state in Syria. There are no good options, military options for the United States in Syria. The lesson in Syria, as in Iraq and Afghanistan, is that civil wars have to be fought internally, and that political reconciliation cannot come from without, it has to come from within. And that can't be imposed by outside influences. We know that from our own history. While the Syrian civil war has caused 100,000 deaths in a country of 23 million, the American Civil War caused 675,000 deaths from a young nation of 34 million people. After spending $2 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan, representing $40,000 in debt for every American family, and the loss of 6,668 American lives, and the physical and mental destruction of tens of thousands of more young Americans, Iraq is as violent today as any time in its history. And Afghanistan is as poor and as corrupt as it's always been. The American people are sick and tired of war. It's time to nation build in America and invest in the growth of the American economy. Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons on his own people, and that is morally reprehensible for certain. He should be condemned universally by international community, and stiff sanctions should be imposed. He should be indicted as a war criminal in the International Tribunal for his murderous deeds. Unfortunately, the use of chemical weapons in this part of the world is not new. Saddam Hussein used them in the Iraq-Iran war between 1983 and 1988, and again against his own civilian population in northern Iraq in 1991. Unfortunately, the stockpiling and use of mustard gas and sarin, thousands of tons of chemical weapons, is all too common in the Middle East today, dating back decades. The international support for the United States-led military strike in Syria, however surgical and limited in scope and time, consists of two countries, Turkey and France, out of 194 countries. The rest of the international community, but for China and Russia, says we support you, America, in your military strike, so long as we don't have to do anything. The Arab League's response to this crisis is pathetically weak, and given their strategic interests, a joke. So here we are, left with trying to topple the last minority regime in the Middle East. And for the third time in a decade, entering a national civil war in that part of the world, essentially alone again. Secretary Kerry, you spoke of the history of the world's response to the use of chemical weapons. Given that history, one would think that more countries would join the U.S. in participating, not supporting, in participating in a military strike against Syria. What gives?